This semester, we're going to be taking an in-depth look at science. Science can be defined as the process of investigation using observation, experimentation, and reasoning that leads to the accumulation of knowledge. While this semester we're going to go ahead and consider science as it applies to the natural world, you should also be aware that science can also be applied to other non-scientific disciplines, given that they also can utilize observations and experimentation and employ reasoning to deal with accumulation of knowledge in those particular disciplines. Scientists spend a lot of time thinking about the natural world. They go ahead and inquire and ask questions about the way in which the world works. They make observations about natural systems, and they also go ahead and use those observations to come up with hypotheses or educated guesses about how they think the world works. They ultimately can test those hypotheses with experiments, and ultimately at the end of experiments they can go ahead and analyze data to come up with conclusions that will go ahead and provide new information about the world. They will document that information and provide that information to other scientists as well as to the general public. Scientists will think critically about the what, when, where, how, and why of ourselves and the world around us. They do so to understand the way things work and why things are the way that they are. And to generate information, they use observation and experimentation. And ultimately, they do these things to try to improve the world in which we live. Scientists will often use different types of thinking to go ahead and try to understand the world around them. One type of thinking would be called inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning is simply discovering general principles through examination of specific cases. Another way of putting this is simply by saying you're putting two and two together. For instance, you might make an observation in one location. Then if you travel to another location and happen to make the same observation and you put two and two together, you might actually be able to come up with a general principle about the way in which something works. Scientists will often develop hypotheses about how the world works based specifically on inductive reasoning. To go ahead and have a better understanding of inductive reasoning, let's consider the following example. The example being you driving to work, and to have to get to work, you have to pass through several lights. Now, as part of inductive reasoning, you're going to go ahead and make observations of specific events. For instance, you're driving down the street at the speed limit, and you happen to observe that the red light turns green just as you approach the intersection. Well, you continue on, and you're maintaining the same speed, driving the speed limit, and you observe the same event at the next several intersections. The traffic light turns green just as you approach the intersections. But when you speed up, the light doesn't change until after you reach the intersection. Therefore, you're stuck at the red light. Based on all of your observations at several lights, you can use inductive reasoning to form a general principle. You conclude that the traffic lights along the street are timed to change in the time it takes your car, traveling at the speed limit, to traverse the distance between them. The second type of thinking is called deductive reasoning, which is using accepted general principles as a guide to explain specific observations. Now keep in mind those accepted general principles ultimately came from inductive reasoning. Well, many of you may be familiar with how a computer works, and you may have heard of the phrase, if A then B. Well, that specifically is going to be an example of deductive reasoning. If A, for instance A being that accepted general principle, then B. If you know something, if you know A or the accepted general principle, then you know what's going to happen if you do this or if you do that. So hence, you're going to use that deductive reasoning, you're going to use that principle to guide your behavior. Let's go ahead and use the example that we used before to now come up with an example of deductive reasoning. Before, we went ahead and determined an accepted general principle, which was that when traffic lights along city streets are timed to change at the time interval it takes traffic to pass between them, the result will be a smooth flow of traffic. That's the general principle that we came up with based on inductive reasoning and based on the fact that we went through several lights, and given that we were going the speed limit, they happened to turn green as we approached them. Now, given that that is our general principle, we then can go ahead and use that general principle to decide to actually go the speed limit, because therefore we will go ahead and anticipate that the red light will turn green as we approach the intersection. Scientific investigation can be divided into 5 main stages, and collectively these 5 stages are referred to as the scientific process. The first part of the scientific process involves observation. Careful observation of a process or a phenomenon, or an organism, for instance. After observation, you can go ahead and then form hypotheses. Remember that these hypotheses are going to be educated guesses. And remember that we're saying educated based on the fact that you've already studied them, based on making several observations. Frequently, scientists will actually form several hypotheses, or alternative hypotheses, rather than forming just one. And with those hypotheses, they can go ahead and create predictions, expected consequences based on the correct hypothesis. After devising your hypotheses, you can go about testing these hypotheses based on performing an experiment. Keep in mind that if you're interested in looking at a process or a phenomenon or an organism, and you're interested in trying to understand how it's impacted by given factors in its environment, you need to realize there are several different factors that could potentially affect that particular process or phenomenon or organism. All of these different factors that are part of the natural environment that could play a role and influence these things are referred to as variables. Now, if you're interested in a specific variable, for instance, let's say you're interested in temperature and how temperature affects a given organism, you might go ahead and subject that particular organism to different temperatures, maybe high temperatures and low temperatures. But as I mentioned, there are several other variables that could also influence that organism. Based on the fact that you're not concerned about those variables, what you need to actually perform is not just any simple experiment, but a controlled experiment where all variables are held constant with the exception of the one being tested. So for instance, you're going to go ahead and allow temperature to vary and have your organism subject to high and low temperatures, but you want to keep everything else the same. You want to go ahead, for instance, and keep pH the same, or humidity, or oxygen level, all of these other things the same, so that you know that they're not responsible for influencing the organism, and you can understand how temperature truly affects it. Next, you're going to go ahead and come up with some sort of conclusion. The conclusion is going to go ahead and be based on the data that you collect from your experiment. The data will either support or fail to support your hypothesis. So based on the results of the experiment, the hypothesis is either going to be accepted or rejected. This figure represents a diagram of the scientific process. Keep in mind that again, we start number 1 with observation. We're going to go ahead and make observations about the natural world in an attempt to understand it. But because the natural world is extremely complex, we're probably going to be left with questions. And so what we're going to go ahead and do is use our knowledge to come up with potential answers, or hypotheses. Our hypotheses will be our best guesses about what's actually going on in the natural world. Then from those hypotheses, we're going to go ahead and devise predictions, and ultimately we're going to test those hypotheses in experiments. And from those experiments, we're going to go ahead and collect data that will either support or fail to support our hypotheses. If the data support the hypotheses, we're going to go ahead and accept those hypotheses. However, if the data fail to support those hypotheses, we'll reject them. Ultimately, based on our decisions to either accept or reject our hypotheses, we're going to go ahead and form conclusions and ultimately gain a better understanding of the natural world. Let's go ahead and consider, as an example of the scientific process, work that I do. I specifically work in feeding ecology. Feeding ecology is the study of interactions among organisms that are linked via consumption, or based on the fact that one thing feeds on another. In this particular image you see here, you have the mangrove tree crab. It's a small crab that typically gets to be no larger than 1 to 2 inches in width. And this crab lives in communities that are called mangroves. These actually are forests that are going to be found along the shoreline in both tropical and subtropical areas. And these crabs live in and amongst the trees and actually feed on the leaves of the trees. There are several different species of mangroves as well. As a feeding ecologist, I try to, number one, determine feeding preferences. So are there certain species that this particular crab would rather feed on over others? As I mentioned, there are different species of mangroves found along the shoreline. And for instance, in Florida, where I do a lot of my work, there are 3 species: the red mangrove, the black mangrove, and the white mangrove. So I'm interested in figuring out specifically what this crab is doing in its environment. What is it going to go ahead and feed on? Well, I'm also interested in not just determining what it feeds on, but also mechanisms responsible for feeding, or why it's choosing to feed on a certain thing. And one of the main mechanisms that's often involved in feeding would be chemistry. For instance, the chemicals that are found in these food resources. And there are a lot of different types of chemicals that can influence feeding. For instance, there are several chemicals that could be classified as feeding deterrents, but also chemicals that could be classified as feeding stimulants. Feeding deterrents actually are those chemicals that make a given food source taste nasty, while feeding stimulants are going to be chemicals that actually make a food resource taste yummy. To illustrate the scientific process in action, let's go ahead and consider my own research as an example. So for instance, I'm interested in determining feeding preferences. So based on that, I'm going to go ahead and start off with observations. I'm going to go ahead and observe that mangrove tree crab in its own natural environment. I'm going to watch it and what it does, and specifically what it's feeding on. Is it feeding on one mangrove species over others? For instance, is it feeding more on the red mangrove leaves than on leaves of other species? Well, I'm going to go ahead and watch the crab, but I'm also going to go ahead and look at the leaves of the different species to see whether or not one of these species is damaged more than the others. Another way I can observe the crab is through actually looking at studies that have been done in the past by other researchers. I can go ahead and try to gain an understanding of what this crab has done, either at different times or in different places or in the same place, and see if that will help me understand what this crab is actually doing. Ultimately, I can take all of that information and I can come up with an hypothesis. For instance, my hypothesis would be that crabs prefer the red mangrove leaves over other leaves. And ultimately, I would use that to predict that crabs will actually eat more red mangrove leaves than those of other species. Given this hypothesis, I can go ahead and now test it in an experiment, in specifically a feeding experiment where I bring these crabs into the lab and I offer them mangrove leaves of different species simultaneously. But keep in mind, I want to do a controlled experiment where the only thing that's going to be different is the fact that I'm offering them different types of food. I want to keep other factors the same. For instance, I want to make sure they all have about the same amount of food, that they're all given water, and that they're all actually in an area that's going to be predator-free. Because sometimes predators can go ahead and influence the different types of foods that these crabs will select. After doing my experiment, ultimately I'm going to collect data and analyze the data, and I'm going to go ahead and be able to come to some conclusion about what the crab is actually doing. And in this particular case, I actually do come to the conclusion that the crab prefers red mangrove leaves. Some hypotheses have been tested time and time again, and each time they've been tested, we've actually found support for those hypotheses, and therefore they've not been rejected. And this indicates a very high degree of certainty. These hypotheses for which this has happened are considered theories. However, there's no absolute truth in science, and acceptance of a theory is only provisional. It's provisional based on the fact that at any given time we could in fact test this given theory and actually find data that fail to support it. Now, to scientists, a theory represents that of which they are most certain. It is the closest thing to truth that we actually know. However, to the general public, a theory often represents a lack of knowledge or a guess. You'll often hear of people flippantly saying, "Oh, it's just a theory." Well, when they're actually saying that, they actually are using the term incorrectly. Because again, keep in mind that a theory has been tested many times. It's an educated guess, not some sort of random guess. Now, there are actually limitations to science. Number one, science is limited to organisms and processes that can be observed and measured. Therefore, supernatural and religious phenomena are beyond the scope of science. Now, there are also practical limits to science. Science cannot be relied upon to solve all problems, and it can identify solutions when they exist, but science cannot invent solutions when they don't exist.